picture the sensory details of this scene. It is February 1564, under the cover of absolute darkness. A lone, rickety merchant's cart rolls out of the gates of Rome, its wooden wheels creaking against the cold cobblestones. To the armed guards at the checkpoint, it looks completely unremarkable. Just another peasant transporting a mundane bale of hay, perhaps heading north to the provincial markets. But hidden inside that scratchy, unassuming bale of hay, which reeks of livestock feed, is a piece of contraband so immensely valuable that city-states would literally go to war over it. It is a corpse. Specifically, the 3-week-old, secretly exhumed body of the greatest genius the Renaissance, and arguably human history, has ever produced, Michelangelo Buonarroti. If you are captivated by the hidden truths, the raw suffering, and the untold brilliance of history's greatest figures, please like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled. Your support allows us to continue unearthing the profound and the tragic. The man orchestrating this morbid, high-stakes smuggling operation was his own nephew, Leonardo Buonarroti. The sheer terror gripping him in that cart must have been suffocating. If the Roman authorities or papal guards caught him trying to sneak the master's body out of the papal states, the political and physical consequences would be catastrophic. Rome desperately wanted the body, believing quite fiercely that because his greatest physical triumphs, like the Sistine Chapel and the Dome of St. Peter's, were in Rome, Michelangelo inherently belonged to the Eternal City. He had become a monument himself, elevated to the status of a holy relic. We usually associate the theft of relics with the bones of saints, not the bones of artists, but to Rome, he was basically divine. Florence, however, wanted him more. They viewed him as their native son, the total embodiment of Florentine intellectual supremacy, and they were never going to let Rome keep him. And so, the body of the man who literally carved the divine into solid marble bounced along a freezing dirt road in a pile of horse feed. Today, we completely bypass the polished, pristine marble myth by opening up a massive stack of historical sources, including contemporary biographies dating back to the 1500s and deeply personal letters. A totally different man emerges. When you stand beneath the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, you perceive pure, untouchable grace and theological perfection. But the hands that ground those pigments and applied that wet plaster belonged to a man who was chronically unhappy, deeply volatile, and constantly at war with the geopolitical world around him. He is defined by bitter, screaming rivalries, absolutely crippling paranoia, and unapologetic decades-long grudges. He fought with his patrons, he fought with his peers, and perhaps most devastatingly, he fought with himself. To understand this transcendent, almost frightening level of genius, we must look at his incredibly strange origins. Born in 1474 or 1475, depending on the specific Florentine method of counting the new year, Michelangelo's family, the Buonarroti, were not artists, nor were they peasants. They aggressively claimed descent from the aristocratic lineage of the Counts of Canossa. His father was a local government official, but the family was experiencing a severe financial decline, essentially living as broke nobles, clinging desperately to their patrician status. As an infant, Michelangelo was sent to a wet nurse in the village of Settignano. This woman was the daughter of a stonemason and was married to a stonemason. Later in life, Michelangelo famously joked that he sucked in his love for hammers and chisels alongside his wet nurse's milk, framing his obsession with physical labor as a biological imperative he ingested and couldn't control. This joke was a remarkable bit of psychological framing. a defense mechanism against a brutal childhood reality. His father and uncles viewed physical labor, which was what sculpture was considered before Michelangelo elevated it, as a massive disgrace to their noble bloodline. In the 15th century, painting and sculpting were considered manual trades, roughly on par with being a high-end carpenter or a shoemaker, and certainly not a pursuit for the nobility. The historical sources are brutal. His family literally physically beat the art out of him. The beatings he endured for drawing were severe. Michelangelo internalized this profound familial rejection and weaponized it. His compulsion to create became an absolute obsession. He eventually secured an apprenticeship under Domenico Ghirlandaio, a very prominent Florentine painter. But the teenager's innate understanding of form was so immediate and natural that it bred intense jealousy in his own master. Ultimately, this prodigy caught the eye of Lorenzo the Magnificent, the de facto ruler of Florence, who brought him into the Medici household, granting him access to an incredible garden of antiquities. It was an artist's playground, and one specific anecdote perfectly encapsulates his obsessive drive. Finding a damaged ancient marble head of a faun, Michelangelo decided to copy it, improvising by opening the faun's mouth and carving a complete set of teeth. Lorenzo de' Medici walked by and playfully critiqued it, bantering that old men always lose a few teeth. It was just a little joke, but Michelangelo's absolute intolerance for imperfection was triggered. The moment Lorenzo left, Michelangelo took his drill and completely hollowed out one of the upper teeth, meticulously chipping away at the marble gum line to mimic the natural recession of tissue that occurs when a tooth falls out over time. Lorenzo was astounded by this astonishingly literal and anatomically precise correction, securing Michelangelo a permanent seat at his table alongside the greatest Neoplatonic philosophers of the era. But that security shattered when Lorenzo died in 1492. The Medicis were expelled. The political climate became incredibly unstable with the rise of the radical friar Savonarola, and Michelangelo became a freelancer in a hostile world. This instability pushed him to execute a highly sophisticated, fraudulent art scam perpetrated on a high-ranking Catholic cardinal, a brilliant scheme requiring a profound understanding of both chemistry and art history. First, he carved a flawless marble statue of a sleeping Eros, or Cupid, capturing the Hellenistic style perfectly. Because fresh marble shines and reflects light differently than stone subjected to centuries of elemental decay, it looked too new. So, he treated the marble, burying it in sour acidic earth to pit the surface, and likely using wood smoke and organic dyes to yellow the polish, simulating the oxidation and dirt accumulation of antiquity. He handed it off to a middleman dealer, who sold it in Rome to Cardinal Raphael Riario for 200 ducats, an astronomical sum equivalent to several years' wages for a highly skilled master craftsman, essentially the price of a substantial estate. Yet, through the classic middleman squeeze, Michelangelo only received 30 ducats. This staggering financial inequity unraveled the plot. The cardinal discovered he was duped and demanded his money back from the dealer. But here, the Renaissance paradigm of art completely flipped. The cardinal realized the forgery was not a piece of ancient magic, but carved by a living man. Instead of being furious, he was in absolute awe of the technical prowess, realizing a modern artist had finally matched the mythical genius of the ancients. The cardinal summoned him to Rome. For this unknown kid, faking the past was the only way to prove he was the future. The scam was a highly calculated, wildly successful audition that led to monumental commissions, culminating in the masterpiece Pietà, and allowed him to return to Florence in 1501 as a triumphant star. His return led directly to the Gigante, one of the most stressful engineering problems in art history. The Florentine government possessed a massive 17-foot-tall block of Carrara marble that had been sitting in a courtyard for 35 years, exposed to the elements and written off as ruined material. Decades earlier, an artist named Agostino di Guccio had tried to carve it and botched it completely, hacking a massive hole between what would be the legs, severely compromising the structural integrity and center of gravity of the stone. Michelangelo looked at this terrifyingly fragile giant paperweight and declared he could fix it. His astounding hubris was matched only by his execution. He designed the David specifically to accommodate that missing stone, shifting the weight and the contrapposto stance to ensure the 12,000-pound sculpture wouldn't snap at the ankles. But this massive, incredibly public success put him on a direct, unavoidable collision course with the undisputed king of the Florentine intellectual scene, Leonardo da Vinci. The dynamic between these two completely destroys the sanitized, romanticized view of Renaissance masters peacefully sharing ideas. They despised each other on a visceral level. It was a fundamental clash of worldviews and aesthetics. Leonardo, 23 years older, was the globally recognized elder statesman of art and the epitome of the urbane courtier. He dressed impeccably in stylish rose-colored silk tunics, smelled of expensive perfumes, surrounded himself with musicians, and approached art through the lens of empirical science, though he was deeply elusive and constantly distracted. Michelangelo was his antithesis, essentially a monk devoted only to stone. He was brooding, highly aggressive, and so intensely consumed by labor that he neglected basic hygiene. He literally slept in his work clothes and heavy leather boots. Accounts state that when he finally took those boots off, after weeks of continuous work, the leather had adhered to his skin, peeling the flesh from his feet. He viewed physical suffering as a necessary sacrifice, a religious asceticism like flagellation through sculpting. Furthermore, he bore the physical mark of his aggression on his face. As a teenager, his sharp tongue provoked a fellow art student, Pietro Torrigiano, into a fistfight. Torrigiano punched him right in the face, completely crushing the cartilage in his nose, leaving Michelangelo with a flattened, crooked profile for the rest of his life. So, you had the perfume scientist in pink silk and the filthy, broken-nosed fanatic covered in marble dust. Leonardo struck the first blow, sitting on the Florentine committee to decide where to display the David. Leonardo quietly suggested placing this masterpiece of hyper-masculine anatomy in an obscure, covered corner and giving it a decent ornament to censor the nudity. This was a brilliantly subtle insult aimed directly at Michelangelo's core theology, as he believed the nude human form was the ultimate reflection of divine perfection. Michelangelo predictably retaliated with raw public aggression. Seeing Leonardo walking with prominent citizens, Michelangelo stormed up and started screaming insults about Leonardo's failed bronze equestrian monument. Leonardo had spent years designing a massive horse for Milan, but got distracted by studying fluid dynamics and the flight of birds, leaving only a clay model that was eventually destroyed by invading French soldiers for target practice. Michelangelo shouted in public, "And to think you were believed by those castrated Milanese roosters," violently targeting Leonardo's deepest psychological insecurity, his chronic inability to bring grand visions to completion. Michelangelo's entire identity, conversely, was built on grueling, obsessive completion. This personal animosity spilled over into a state-sponsored artistic bloodsport. In 1503, Piero Soderini, head of the Florentine Republic, commissioned both men to paint massive opposing walls in the council hall of the Palazzo Vecchio. Leonardo assigned the Battle of Anghiari and Michelangelo the Battle of Cassina. They weaponized their stylistic differences in their preparatory sketches. Leonardo openly criticized Michelangelo's obsession with bulk and musculature, writing that Michelangelo's tension-filled figures looked less like human beings and more like bags of nuts or bundles of radishes. Yet, structurally, this massive showdown ended in a bizarre anticlimax, as neither man finished. Leonardo tried an experimental method of applying oil paints to a thick undercoat, which was a catastrophic failure. The paint melted before it could dry. Michelangelo, meanwhile, finished a spectacular, highly influential full-scale cartoon. But before he could begin painting the actual wall, the geopolitical landscape shifted abruptly. He received a summons from a force he could not ignore: Pope Julius II, the terrifying warrior pope. It was an invitation that sounded like an absolute paradise for a sculptor, but it was about to devolve into a staggering 40-year psychological nightmare that would completely break his spirit. Pope Julius II was a terrifying figure. He was less a peaceful spiritual shepherd and more a military general who personally led armies into battle. He was obsessed with expanding the geopolitical borders of the Papal States and restoring the imperial glory of ancient Rome, and his ego was staggering. In 1505, he offered Michelangelo a commission that sounded like absolute paradise for a sculptor, but which would slowly devolve into a 40-year psychological nightmare. Julius envisioned a freestanding mausoleum in the center of the new St. Peter's Basilica that would dwarf the monuments of Roman emperors. The scale was almost incomprehensible. The plans detailed a structure 3 stories high, covered in 47 life-size or colossal marble statues. For Michelangelo, this wasn't just a job. It was the ultimate canvas. With unlimited funding to sculpt an entire universe of figures, the ambition completely consumed him. He immediately left Rome and spent the next 8 months in the Carrara Mountains. We must understand the brutal logistics of 16th century quarrying. It was highly dangerous, agonizing labor. Michelangelo personally scrambled up sheer cliff faces, selecting veins of pristine white stone, and supervising the workers who used wooden wedges soaked in water to split the marble from the mountain. He was literally feverish with ambition, writing that he looked out at the peaks and hallucinated carving an entire mountain into a colossus that could be seen by sailors miles out at sea. He finally managed to transport a literal plaza's worth of giant marble blocks back to Rome. But while he was away, engaging in this grueling physical labor, the political maneuvering in the Vatican had turned against him. Enter Bramante. Bramante was a rival architect overseeing the redesign of St. Peter's Basilica, and he viewed Michelangelo as an existential threat to his own funding and influence. Bramante executed a brilliant piece of psychological warfare. Knowing Pope Julius was deeply superstitious, he casually got into the Pope's ear and suggested that it was terrible luck to build one's own tomb while still alive. He framed it as an open invitation to death. The manipulation worked flawlessly. Pope Julius abruptly cut off all funding for the project. The financial implications for Michelangelo were disastrous. He had already hired crews and held outstanding debts for the transportation of thousands of pounds of marble. Yet suddenly the Vatican bank was closed to him. Stuck with the bill, he went to the papal palace to demand an audience to get the money he was owed. He was repeatedly denied entry. Finally, a guard physically barred his path, coldly stating he had orders not to admit him. To publicly humiliate a man with Michelangelo's pride and temper was incredibly dangerous. Michelangelo flew into a state of absolute paranoid rage. He genuinely believed Bramante was not only trying to ruin him financially, but was actively plotting to have him assassinated. Storming back to his workshop, he ordered his servants to sell all of his belongings to Jewish merchants, and he fled Rome on horseback. He left a staggeringly insolent letter for the Pope, essentially stating that if the pontiff wanted him, he could come find him, because he was done. Fleeing the papal states and defying a direct order from the warrior Pope was functionally treason. It is a miracle Julius didn't just have him executed. The furious Pope sent a posse of 5 armed couriers chasing after him. They cornered Michelangelo in Florentine territory, but the completely unyielding artist threatened to have the papal couriers murdered if they attempted to physically detain him. This created a massive diplomatic crisis. The head of the Florentine government realized that Pope Julius might literally march an army into Florence just to retrieve his sculptor, and Florence was not about to go to war over an artist's ego. Florence forced Michelangelo to return. In the recently conquered city of Bologna, a deeply tense, humbling reconciliation took place as Michelangelo knelt before the Pope. Julius issued a pardon, but immediately forced Michelangelo to cast a massive bronze statue of himself to loom over Bologna as punishment. Michelangelo hated working in bronze, but he complied, and the massive statue of Pope Julius was hoisted above the basilica. Yet, this resulted in one of the darkest, funniest pieces of historical irony in the Renaissance. The statue only survived for 3 years. When the citizens of Bologna successfully rebelled against the Papal States, they tore the statue down, smashed it to pieces, and melted the bronze down to forge a massive artillery cannon. They mockingly named the cannon La Giulia after the Pope, turning his vanity project into a weapon against him. The destruction of the bronze was a potent metaphor for the entire tomb project. Michelangelo's biographer, Ascanio Condivi, referred to the ensuing decades as the tragedy of the tomb. Following the death of Pope Julius in 1513, the heirs demanded the monument's completion, but the money was still an issue. New popes took power and refused to allow the greatest living artist to waste his time finishing a vanity project for a dead predecessor. It became a bureaucratic nightmare. The contract for the tomb was forcibly revised 5 separate times. In 1513, 1516, 1525, 1532, and finally in 1542. Over 40 years, his grand 3-story freestanding colossus was systematically downsized. The psychological toll of this failure was immense. Michelangelo felt he had completely squandered his prime years, stuck in legal limbo, constantly fending off lawsuits from the Della Rovere family, Julius's heirs, who actually accused him of embezzling the funds. Ultimately, the tomb was reduced to a wall monument, shoved into a secondary church, San Pietro in Vincoli. It features the breathtakingly powerful statue of Moses, flanked by Rachel and Leah. But the effigy of the Pope himself is awkward and deeply underwhelming. Today, visitors don't travel to that church to see the tomb of Pope Julius II. They travel to see Michelangelo's Moses. The sheer power of the art completely eclipsed the ego of the patron. But long before the tomb project finally whimpered to a close, right at the beginning of this ordeal, his rival Bramante decided that bankrupting Michelangelo wasn't enough. Bramante wanted to completely destroy Michelangelo's artistic reputation. This deep, insidious scheming led to what is arguably the most famous commission in human history, the sealing of the Sistine Chapel. Bramante convinced Pope Julius II to force Michelangelo to paint the vast ceiling, knowing that Michelangelo defined himself exclusively as a sculptor. He had very limited experience with buon fresco, which is arguably the most complex, unforgiving medium in the visual arts. Bramante fully anticipated that Michelangelo would fail spectacularly, humiliate himself in the Pope's private chapel, and leave the field clear for Bramante's own protege, a brilliant young artist named Raphael. To understand the absolute technical miracle of the Sistine Chapel, we must break down why buon fresco is so unforgiving. You are not just painting on a wall, you are painting into wet plaster. You apply a layer of wet lime plaster, called the intonaco, to the wall. You then have a window of only a few hours to apply water-based pigments before the plaster begins to dry and chemically set. As the calcium hydroxide in the plaster reacts with the carbon dioxide in the air, it forms calcium carbonate. The pigment becomes physically locked inside the stone wall. If you make a mistake, or if the plaster dries before you finish, you cannot paint over it. You have to literally take a hammer and chisel, smash the wall down to the brick, and start over the next day. Michelangelo was terrified. He wrote letters begging the Pope to give the job to someone else, explicitly stating, "Painting is not my art." But you cannot refuse the warrior Pope. So, in 1508, he designed his own scaffolding system and began. We must dispel the persistent Hollywood myth right now. He did not paint the ceiling lying on his back. The reality was much more physically agonizing. He painted standing up, leaning awkwardly backward, reaching high above his head for hours on end. He wrote a highly detailed, miserable poem describing the physical toll, detailing his spine bending backward, like a Syrian bow, his chest crushed up against his chin, and his face constantly bathed in a dripping mosaic of wet plaster and pigment. He suffered from severe eye strain, later writing that, for months after finishing, he could only read letters if he held them above his head and looked up, as if the physical agony and the pressure of the medium weren't enough. While he was isolated on that scaffolding, Bramante's protege arrived in Rome. Raphael was everything Michelangelo was not. He was only 26 years old, incredibly handsome, effortlessly charming, and universally adored. He immediately won a massive commission to paint the Pope's private library, the Stanza della Segnatura, right down the hall from the Sistine Chapel. The dichotomy between the two artists was profound. Michelangelo was living in a monastic gloom consumed by paranoia, literally locking his assistants out of the chapel because he trusted no one. Raphael, meanwhile, was deeply embedded in the sybaritic, pleasure-seeking lifestyle of the Roman court, highly sociable and constantly surrounded by a large entourage of admiring students and wealthy patrons. This dynamic sent Michelangelo's paranoia into overdrive. When Raphael began incorporating vastly more dynamic, heavily muscled figures into his frescoes, clearly influenced by catching glimpses of Michelangelo's work in progress, Michelangelo snapped. He publicly accused this 26-year-old prodigy of breaking into the Sistine Chapel at night to copy his anatomy and steal his intellectual property. Raphael, like any brilliant artist, was indeed absorbing and adapting the revolutionary anatomical techniques Michelangelo was developing. But he deeply resented the sheer, unprovoked animosity radiating from the older master. Raphael possessed a highly sophisticated sense of humor, which he utilized to deliver one of the greatest visual insults in art history. In his absolute masterpiece fresco, The School of Athens, Raphael painted a grand gathering of the greatest philosophers of antiquity, Plato, Aristotle, Socrates. And in the foreground, he painted the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, historically known as the weeping philosopher because of his melancholic, misanthropic nature. He gave Heraclitus the exact face of Michelangelo. It was a devastatingly accurate, entirely unflattering portrait. He painted Michelangelo wearing his infamous, heavy leather boots, slouched over a block of stone, looking incredibly grumpy, completely isolated, and totally disconnected from all the other happy, socializing philosophers around him. It was a brilliant duality, The ultimate frenemy move. Raphael acknowledged Michelangelo's monumental genius by placing him in the ultimate pantheon of human intellect, but he brutally mocked his miserable, antisocial personality. The rivalry reached a boiling point when the Sistine ceiling was finally unveiled in 1512. The sheer awe it inspired was unprecedented. But shortly after the unveiling, a foreign ambassador visiting the Vatican looked up at the ceiling and mistakenly announced to the court that it was painted by Raphael. One cannot even fathom the rage Michelangelo must have felt in that moment. You endure 4 years of literal physical torture to prove your enemies wrong. You achieve the impossible, and the handsome, popular kid gets the credit. It raises a compelling psychological question. Is spite the ultimate artistic muse? Because he fundamentally created the most famous painting in human history out of sheer defiance. The friction of that rivalry pushed both men to the absolute zenith of high Renaissance art. Michelangelo's terribilità, his terrifying, awe-inspiring power, and Raphael's sublime, harmonious grace created a dynamic tension that defined an entire era. They forced each other to evolve, but Michelangelo's capacity to harbor resentment was legendary, which brings us to an event decades later that perfectly illustrates his absolute, unapologetic commitment to revenge. We are jumping forward to the 1530s now. Michelangelo is in his 60s. He is an older, deeply respected, but still highly volatile man who has not mellowed out one bit. A new pontiff, Pope Paul III, forces him back into the Sistine Chapel to paint the massive altar wall. While the ceiling had been a triumph of the High Renaissance, this new commission, The Last Judgment, which he completes in 1541, sparks a theological scandal that threatens to completely destroy Michelangelo's legacy. The world is different now. The geopolitical and religious climate has drastically changed since he painted the ceiling. The Catholic Church has been traumatized by the 1527 sack of Rome, and they are facing the existential threat of the Protestant Reformation. The stakes are much higher. Consequently, The Last Judgment is not a serene, orderly vision of heaven and hell. It is a terrifying, chaotic, swirling vortex of heavily muscled, grotesque figures. At the center, Christ is depicted not as the traditional, gentle, bearded savior. Michelangelo throws that out entirely, painting Christ as a massive, heavily muscled, beardless Apollo, violently casting the damned down to hell. Furthermore, almost every single figure, including the holiest saints and martyrs, is depicted completely and unapologetically nude. This immediately triggers outrage among the conservative factions within the Vatican. Specifically, the Pope's Master of Ceremonies gets a sneak peek at the fresco before it is officially unveiled, and he is absolutely appalled by the theological audacity. He loudly complains to the Pope, stating on the record that this extreme display of genitalia is entirely disgraceful, notoriously declaring that it is a work fit for public baths and taverns, not a papal chapel. To look at the magnum opus of the greatest living artist, a man who has dedicated his life to the church, and equate his work to the decoration of a brothel or a bathhouse, is a staggering, unforgivable insult. Michelangelo's response is a masterclass in petty historical retaliation. He alters the bottom right corner of the fresco, the section depicting the entry into hell. There, he paints Minos, the mythological judge of the underworld, meticulously giving Minos the exact face of the Pope's Master of Ceremonies. He literally puts his critic in hell. But he doesn't stop there. He gives the official a pair of massive donkey ears to permanently label him a fool. And for the ultimate visual punchline, specifically because the official complained about the nudity, Michelangelo paints a massive demonic serpent coiled tightly around his body, with the snake's fangs actively and violently biting down on his genitals. He permanently immortalizes a high-ranking Vatican official as a demon suffering a highly specific, eternal, and deeply humiliating punishment. The humiliated official immediately runs to Pope Paul III, demanding that the Pope order Michelangelo to paint over the caricature. But the Pope, possessing a sharp wit of his own, basically shrugs and says that while God has given him authority in heaven and on earth, his jurisdiction does not extend to hell, so the official is going to have to stay there. It is incredibly funny, but the underlying historical forces at play are deadly serious. This is a profound historical and religious paradigm shift. The Catholic Church is aggressively launching the Counter-Reformation, a defensive reaction to combat Protestant criticisms regarding the Church's decadence and worldliness. In 1563, the Council of Trent formally issues strict decrees against lasciviousness in religious art, mandating that sacred imagery must inspire piety, not physical desire. Michelangelo's deeply humanistic belief that the naked human body is the clearest reflection of God collides violently with this new era of dogmatism. He transitions from being the defining voice of the Renaissance to becoming the primary target of historical art censorship. In 1564, right before Michelangelo dies, the censorship decree is retroactively applied to the Last Judgment. The church hires one of Michelangelo's own friends and followers to go in with scaffolding and systematically paint loincloths and drapes over the offending nudes defacing his masterpiece. This artist is forever stamped in history with the humiliating nickname Il Bragattone, which translates to the breeches maker. It is a devastating irony. The artist, who spent a lifetime finding the divine in the tension of human anatomy, lives just long enough to see his own church cover up his masterpiece in the name of propriety. Those physical interventions remained in place for centuries, many only being removed during the expensive restorations in the 1990s. We have spent so much time exploring this fiercely aggressive, spiteful, paranoid public figure, the man screaming insults in the public square, the monster painting his enemies in hell. But who is the man beneath the leather boots? As his physical body begins to fail him, we actually see a deeply sensitive, profoundly vulnerable soul emerge, revealed through two incredibly intense relationships late in his life. Michelangelo famously wrote in a letter once, "I have no friends of any kind, nor do I want them." But the archives prove that was just a brittle defense mechanism. The first bond began in 1532, when he met a young Roman aristocrat. Contemporary sources describe this young man as possessing incomparable physical beauty, profound elegance, and sharp intellect. Michelangelo is utterly consumed by him, dedicating hundreds of incredibly passionate sonnets to him and creating flawless presentation drawings. These were not preparatory sketches for a painting. Highly finished, intricate chalk drawings of mythological scenes like the rape of Ganymede and the punishment of Titius were intimate gifts of devotion. This aristocrat remains his closest, most loyal companion for 32 years, eventually holding his hand when Michelangelo dies. The historical debate regarding the precise nature of this relationship has raged for centuries. Some scholars analyzing the intensely erotic language of his poetry, alongside highly suggestive epitaphs he wrote for another young man, argue it was a consummated sexual relationship. Others contend it was a purely Platonic bond, steeped deeply in Neoplatonic philosophy. The belief that the contemplation of perfect physical beauty is the mechanism by which the soul elevates itself toward the divine. Regardless of the physical reality, what is undeniable is the profound emotional and psychological anchor this companion provided. While he poured all of his rage and tension into cold marble, his poetry was the medium where he finally allowed himself to be vulnerable. His poetry also chronicles the second great relationship of his later life, which profoundly shifted his theology. In the late 1530s, he meets a highly respected, deeply intellectual noblewoman and poet. They connect on a level of profound spiritual intensity, both actively involved with a group of Catholic reformists known as the spirituali. They are trying to save the Church from within by adopting theological concepts that were fueling the Protestant Reformation, believing deeply in the doctrine of justification by faith alone. This is the theological concept that salvation cannot be earned through outward rituals, the purchase of indulgences or good works, but comes exclusively through an internal, grace-given faith in Christ's sacrifice. Under her influence as his spiritual guide, we see a radical shift in Michelangelo's art and poetry. You cannot carve justification by faith, you carve brokenness. He abandons the perfect anatomy, shifting entirely away from his lifelong obsession with physical perfection. He begins to view his previous devotion to the beauty of the human body as a vanity that distracts from God. His later poetry speaks of a shaken faith and a deep fear of damnation. If you compare his youthful Pietà in St. Peter's, flawless, polished, serene, with his final unfinished sculpture, the Rondinini Pietà, the contrast is shocking. The Rondinini is elongated, rough, almost ghostly. The bodies of Mary and Christ are fused together, barely emerging from the rough stone. It is no longer about anatomy. It is purely about spiritual suffering and surrender. This aristocratic companion represented his ultimate appreciation of earthly perfection, while this noblewoman guided him toward a fearful devotion to the divine. It paints a portrait of a man completely at war with his own brilliant capabilities. This lifelong, unrelenting intensity, the agonizing labor on the scaffolding, the geopolitical stress of dealing with warring popes, the bitter, decades-long rivalries, inevitably destroys his physical body. He suffered terribly in his final decades. The primary sources contain letters where he details agonizing bouts of kidney stones, grimly describing the gravel in his urine. He was crippled by severe osteoarthritis and gout that knotted his hands and swelled his knees. But his work ethic never wavered. He was actively designing the massive dome of St. Peter's Basilica right up until his final days. Finally, on February 18, 1564, just weeks shy of his 89th birthday, Michelangelo dies in his home in Rome. He achieves something almost entirely unprecedented for an artist in that era. He dies with unimaginable, vast wealth and international mythical fame. He is the first artist in history to have not one, but two comprehensive biographies published about him while he is still alive, one by Vasari and one by his assistant Condivi. He had transitioned from a mortal man into a living institution, which brings us full circle to that creaking cart in the dark. Rome burdens him with a massive state-sponsored ceremony, but the Duke of Florence decrees that Florence must possess the ultimate prize of the Renaissance. And so, the heist is initiated. Leonardo Buonarroti smuggles the body in the hay bale. When the cart finally arrives in Florence, the authorities try to keep it quiet, but the secret leaks instantly. The crowds that flood the streets are so massive, so chaotic and desperate to touch the coffin, that the pallbearers can barely physically force their way into the Basilica of Santa Croce. He is eventually laid to rest in a magnificent tomb, surrounded by weeping statues representing painting, sculpture, and architecture. It is a violently dramatic, deeply political end for a life entirely defined by drama and politics. He was fought over fiercely in life by popes and kings, and he was fought over fiercely in death. It leaves you with a lingering, almost haunting question to consider. Michelangelo famously wrote a Neoplatonic concept into his poetry, stating essentially that every block of stone has a statue inside it, and it is the task of the sculptor to discover it. He believed his sacred duty was to chip away the excess material to set the pure figure free. But when you examine his actual life, bound by 40-year legal contracts, trapped by the terrifying demands of warrior popes, consumed by relentless paranoia, and crushed by the sheer suffocating weight of his own monumental reputation, did Michelangelo ultimately become a prisoner, trapped inside his own myth? Was he forced to spend 88 years painfully chipping away at his own life, his own physical health, and his own happiness, just to set the art free for the rest of humanity? That is the profound, tragic tension of his existence. The ultimate cost of his immortality was the man himself. It is something to deeply mull over the next time you look at a picture of the David or the Sistine Chapel. Thank you all for joining us on this incredible exploration into the source material. If this exploration changed how you view the raw reality of the Renaissance, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Legendary Lives Unveiled. Drop a comment below. Who do you think won the ultimate historical rivalry? The elegant, scientific Leonardo, the charming, sociable Raphael, or the brooding, brilliant Michelangelo? Until next time, keep exploring.